We now speak to political economist Professor Patrick Bond, who is currently in Germany to talk about these developments and relations between the three countries. A very good evening to you, Prof. Thanks so much for speaking to us. So let's just first start with the strategic importance of Germany being the one to speak up so boldly about this.
Thank you very much, Tsipisa, and it's great to be in Berlin because I just happen to be at a conference here. It will be the likes of Friedrich Merz, who's coming from an ideology, let's call it neoconservative and neoliberal. He was formerly from BlackRock, a major financier, and he has taken over the Conservative Party and earlier this year won an election fairly decisively. But he is a far right. Let's think about it as sort of paleo-conservative. That's what they call this MAGA, Make America Great. And here in Germany, it's called the Alternative for Germany. And it's this sort of neo-Nazi, a bit of a sort of fascistic element. And so they obviously are different than what Friedrich Merz and his predecessor, who's part of this government, whose name is Scholz, and the Social Democratic Party are all about. And that they're really all about assimilation of countries like South Africa, and especially, Tsipisa, they're worried about Russia if Donald Trump pulls away from Ukraine and basically helps Vladimir Putin consolidate this huge chunk of the east side of Ukraine. And the worry here in Berlin is whether maybe the next attack from Russia will be on a European state within NATO, within the European Union. And then because Donald Trump's quite unreliable, he's already said maybe NATO won't really enforce its policies of supporting each other. And at that point, I think Friedrich Merz says, well, maybe we need allies like Cyril Ramaphosa. So I see this in a bigger geopolitical and ideological context where Merz isn't very happy with the way Donald Trump's running the world.
And you say that it's because then what Donald Trump represents is a broader paleo-conservative ideology that's hostile to multilateral systems like the G20. So what is then likely to happen when the G7 meets? Is Germany going to try and ramp up more support for its stance when it says South Africa is a very important and strategic voice in geopolitics, given the challenges that the globe is facing?
Yes, now all of our South African audience knows that the G20 combines the G7, that is the West, the sort of imperial powers, the colonial powers, the US, Europe, Canada, Japan on the one hand, plus BRICS and a few others on the other. And now what if you're in the G7 and you're hosting it next year, as the French president Emmanuel Macron is, then you react to Donald Trump's brutality by inviting Cyril Ramaphosa and make the South Africans feel comfortable within the G7. Now, the G20 is only in December, middle of December. It's about 13 months away. So things will change, obviously. But Donald Trump, he may be under all kinds of pressure. He will have probably lost the Republican control of the Congress. He'll probably be on the defensive. His own right-wing MAGA at this point is already splitting over questions like the Jeffrey Epstein pedophilia sex scandal and Israel, where there are people saying, well, maybe Israel shouldn't have so much power over the U.S. government. People in Trump's own coalition, the far right. So it's a tenuous situation, and I kind of feel that what Trump's doing with his inappropriate discussions about South Africa, the so-called genocide of Afrikaner farmers. Don't forget that it's actually Trump who's hurting Afrikaner farmers the most with his tariffs, especially now the tariffs that remain on grapes and vineyard products. But the main thing is that Trump is always speaking to a racist base, that is the white male left out, the sort of working class, the lower petty bourgeoisie, and for them somehow or other claiming that Afrikaner farmers are suffering, and that's why Trump can justify not going to the G20. Merz said it in an interesting way, the German Chancellor. He said that Trump is basically throwing away his soft capital. He's tossing out the influence that he really needs. especially because Africa does have the most votes in the UN General Assembly, 54 roughly votes. And so it's a big gamble for Donald Trump just to be racist for the sake of supporting his own sort of ideological and maybe, sociocultural base. And that's where I think if we get into those serious geopolitical problems confronting the world, like the difficulty of getting peace in Gaza, in West Asia, or in Ukraine, or for that matter, Sudan and the Eastern DRC, Donald Trump just stands in the way. And I'd, of course, add that what we saw in South Africa on the weekend, we also saw in Brazil the prior 2 weeks, because Donald Trump and his people walked out of the climate summit. They've walked out of the World Health Organization. They've walked out of the United Nations Cultural Organization, UNESCO. They've walked out of, sort of the World Trade Organization and creating trade chaos. And in all these ways, it's a piece of big questions arise. Should there be a G20 hosted by Donald Trump? Maybe it's a chance in the course of the next year to actually vote Trump off the island, get all the other members of that G20 and maybe meet in Mexico with the president there, Claudia Sheinbaum. She's probably the best of the whole lot of them, to host instead of Trump in his Miami golf course.
And actually, that's the question I was about to ask you. Now, what does the G20 framework say? Can Donald Trump, as the US president, take such a unilateral stance? Are there rules that prohibit him from doing that? And as you mentioned, that there is then the option of having another country host it. How would that be facilitated? How would it work within the G20 framework?
Well, we have two precedents, and one is that Barack Obama tossed out Russia from the G8, and it's now called the G7. And the reason was in 2014 that Vladimir Putin authorized the invasion of Crimea, that big southern chunk of the Ukraine. And so Obama said, get out of the G7, G8 now, and then it'll be G7. He also tried to get them out of G20. He didn't have a sufficient consensus. So that's really what you need. You need enough votes to say, really, we don't want you in. And it really should be a broad consensus. The other precedent that I find compelling is that sometimes when the U.S. is extremely aggressive, and I've lived in that side and I know just how bad it can be ideologically, let's say you're Cuba or you're Palestine. 1988, going back nearly 40 years, you could find that Yasser Arafat, the Palestine Liberation Organization leader, was not allowed to come because he couldn't get a visa. And this is, of course, what Trump is threatening President Ramaphosa and his allies and his colleagues here with. No visa, you can't come. Even if the G20 doesn't expel you, we won't let you in. That's the sort of threat. Now, what happened in 1988 is revealing, because what happened in the United Nations General Assembly in December 1988, when President Ronald Reagan denied Arafat a visa to come visit and to be part of a discussion, well, the whole UN General Assembly moved to Geneva. They actually reconstituted in Switzerland, the second of the UN cities. Maybe there's an option to call for a move of the United Nations from New York, given, and we saw this again just a couple of months ago in September, where Mohammed Abbas, the Palestine Authority president, was not allowed to come because, again, denied a visa. And that's the very openly illegal and sort of very unprocedural way that the United States is operating. We just saw, for example, a shooting in Washington, D.C., an Afghan who had been part of the U.S. Sort of operations in Afghanistan, and he moved to the United States in 2021. So he killed a couple of the National Guard. And what Trump has replied with that last night, with saying, we will not let any third world people come here now. So this is extreme, absolutely illegal and out of control. And that means, I think, people may want to say, well, actually, we can't really do business in Manhattan. Maybe, Geneva, yeah, but maybe we should even push for Nairobi as the next headquarters of the United Nations, at least for the next 3 years, until Donald Trump and his sort of team, hopefully, is voted out.
As they say, watch the space. Patrick, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Professor Bond is a political economist speaking to us from Germany, as he says, where the country has been the first of the major powers to stand up and admonish US President Donald Trump for his unilateral move to turf South Africa from the G20 meeting in 2026 when